Good evening to you. Good evening to you. Good evening. Won't you share with a friend or two? Good evening, good evening to you. Good evening, good evening to you. You. Good evening, good evening, good evening to you. Good evening. Good evening to you. Good evening and welcome to Daring Dialogues. I'm your host tonight, Shantae Charles. I hope that you have been having a great and wonderful day. We are back with our Women's History Month readings, where we are learning about various women across the world and also some very iconic songstresses this month. Also, want to remind you to tune in tomorrow evening, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as we are reading with author Kenyatta Manley on the platform. And I'm very excited, and I hope that you all will tune in for the reading and the conversation that we will be having. So let's jump right in. Tonight, I'm going to start with the songstresses first, and then I'm going to go to the book Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls. So let's start there first with She Raised Her Voice, 50 Black Women Who Sang Their Way Into Music History. Let's take a look. Tonight, we are starting out with a young woman who is very much a music icon. She has also released a documentary recently, and that is Janet Jackson. It's always a good thing when we have icons who are still living and who are still able to tell their own story the way that they want to tell it. And I certainly applaud her and commend her for that. Janet Jackson was born May 16th, 1966. So she's coming up on a birthday soon. The genres that she primarily operates in is R&B and pop. The youngest of music's royal family. Janet says, "I would hope my legacy would be bringing smiles to faces, happiness with my music." As the youngest of 10 children, including pop megastar Michael Jackson and the extraordinary R&B pop group the Jackson 5, composed of her brothers, Janet Jackson was destined to be a world-famous singer. She became that and much more, having sold more than 180 million albums across the globe, as well as working as an actress throughout her long career. Janet got her start by performing on her family's TV show, The Jacksons, in 1976. She would act, sing, and dance alongside her brothers and sisters who already had music careers and lots of fame. Before she signed to a record label and began releasing music at 16 years old, Janet worked as an actor in the beloved 1970s and 80s TV shows Good Times, Different Strokes, and Fame, a show that was set in a performing arts school. It took time for Janet's music career to grow, as her first two solo albums, Janet Jackson and Dream Street, were not as successful as her third and fourth albums, Control and Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation 1814, which sold millions of records worldwide. With Control, she signed on to work with producers Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, whose innovative music combined R&B, hip-hop, dance, and industrial machine music to create a new sound for Janet and her generation of music fans. Control had a strong focus on girl empowerment and self-awareness with songs like Let's Wait a While, The Pleasure Principle, Control, and What Have You Done for Me Lately. The record sold 5 million copies in the United States and 10 million worldwide. The music of her fourth album, Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation 1814, was about speaking out for those who didn't have a voice in the world and those who suffered from poverty. Janet sang about war and gun violence and how society needs to work together to create a better world. The album was dark and serious in tone, and it showed a side of Janet that had not been seen before. A woman who wanted to talk about difficult topics in order to make the world a better place. This album went on to sell 12 million copies, and Janet became a global superstar. Her Rhythm Nation tour sold out all over the world within minutes. In 1993, Janet's acting and music careers flowed into one as she starred in the film Poetic Justice with rapper Tupac Shakur while releasing her fifth album, Janet. In real life, she is known to be soft-spoken and very private. She is extremely smart and uses her music to inspire people to treat one another with respect. Her albums include The Velvet Rope, All For You, Demita Joe, 20YO, Discipline, and Unbreakable in 2015. All of these albums share stories of pain, hope, and healing with her fans. Janet Jackson found her voice through her music so others could find their own hope and freedom. Janet Jackson. Next up, we have Mahalia Jackson. Mahalia Jackson lived from October 26 to 1911 to January 27, 1972. She is known as the Queen of Gospel. She said, "When you sing gospel, you have a feeling there's a cure for what's wrong." To many people around the world, there is no doubt that Mahalia Jackson is the Queen of Gospel. She earned this title because she was close to powerful leaders of the 1960s civil rights movement and was chosen to sing at the March on Washington in 1963 to more than 200,000 people right before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his historic I Have a Dream speech. As a matter of fact, Mahalia played a small part in that speech when she shouted out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." Mahalia was born in 1911 to a poor family in New Orleans. Her mother died before Mahalia was 7 years old, and she had to leave school in the 8th grade to earn money for her family. She lived with her Aunt Duke, who was very strict, but Aunt Duke also took her to church every Sunday, where Mahalia learned about the power of gospel music. Mahalia thought gospel had a way of easing the minds and souls of others in the midst of racism and segregation. The hope and comfort she found in singing those songs followed her throughout her career. In 1928, Mahalia moved from New Orleans to Chicago and began to sing at Greater Salem Missionary Baptist Church. Mahalia's voice was undeniably beautiful, attracting attention from Christian Black communities. In 1931, when Mahalia was 20 years old, she moved to Chicago. She quickly found a church to attend, and on her first visit to Greater Salem Baptist Church, she felt it in her spirit to sing, "Hand me down my silver trumpet, Gabriel," in front of the entire church. After hearing this spontaneous performance, Mahalia was invited to sing with the church's choir. She toured around Chicago and nearby towns. Her voice caught the attention of gospel songwriter, composer, and father of gospel music, Thomas Dorsey, who took her under his wing. For the next 5 years, she traveled singing Thomas Dorsey's songs and making a name for herself. Along with her musical tours, she recorded nearly 30 albums over the course of her life, which allowed her music to expand beyond the poor and working class Black community to white Americans and gospel lovers around the globe. Her albums sold millions of copies during her lifetime. Nonetheless, because Mahalia had been poor and from the South, her heart was always connected to the struggles of the less fortunate who suffered from segregation and joblessness. Mahalia's voice was pure and soothing. She could heal the spirits of many when she sang gospel songs and hymns like "Move On Up a Little Higher," "Go Tell It on the Mountain," "The Lord's Prayer," and "Didn't It Rain?" In 1950, she gave her first performance at Carnegie Hall in New York City, a very prestigious place for singers to appear. Even though Mahalia became a wealthy international star, she still experienced prejudice in her own life. For example, when she tried to buy a house in Chicago, white real estate agents refused to sell her one simply because she was black. When she did settle into a house, her white neighbors shot bullets through her window. The song she was singing about overcoming the pain of her people also guided her to have strength throughout her own life. Mahalia Jackson was a brave, compassionate, and selfless person who became one of the most powerful women in America through her music and undying service to others. Mahalia Jackson. And our last songstress for this evening is Etta James. Etta James, born January 25th, 1938, and transitioned January 20th, 2012. Her genres included R&B and rock and roll. She was a powerful vocal influencer. She said, "What happens is, when I perform, I'm somewhere else. I go back in time and get in touch with who I really am. I forget my troubles, my worries." R&B rock and roll singer Etta James did not have an easy childhood, as many of these songstresses are turning out to show us. A bright spot in her young life was her mother making sure Etta learned to sing at the age of 5. Etta took lessons from James Earl Hines, the choir master at St. Paul Baptist Church in Los Angeles. James was not very nice to her, but despite that, Etta was a strong girl and developed a loud, confident singing voice. Etta lived for a time in foster care because her mom couldn't take care of her. One of her foster mothers was also hard on her. She would wake her up at night and make her sing for people during late night parties. Throughout her life, Etta remembered the struggles of her younger years, and this often made it hard for her to perform for people on the spot. When Etta became a teenager, her birth mom began to care for her again and moved her to San Francisco, where Etta started a girls singing group called the Creolettes in the early 1950s. When she was 14 years old, Etta met Johnny Otis, an older musician who recognized her talent while looking for someone to sing a song called Roll With Me Henry, which was later renamed The Wallflower. Johnny Otis is also the person who changed her name from Jamesetta Hawkins, the name she was born with, to Etta James. Etta quickly rose to stardom after The Wallflower became an R&B hit in 1955. She toured with famous musicians of the time like Little Richard and Ike and Tina Turner. Her first major solo hit song was a romantic song called All I Could Do Was Cry. And in 1960, she released her first album, At Last, which included another one of her popular songs, A Sunday Kind of Love. But to this day, Etta is best known for deeply powerful love song of hers, At Last. Etta made music throughout the 1960s and early 70s, but then she stopped her growing career for about 10 years because of struggles in her personal life. However, she successfully made a comeback by singing at the 1984 Summer Olympics. In the late 80s and 90s, Etta returned with successful albums like 7-Year Itch and Mystery Lady, songs of Billie Holiday. Etta had a strong, low, bellowing voice that was sometimes gravelly and raw. Her singing style was loved by many women musicians who wanted to sing just like her. Etta James touched so many people with her voice. She will go down in history for being a vocal influence for some of the world's greatest singers today, including Jennifer Hudson and Beyonce. So that was our songstresses for the evening. Next week, Lord willing, we will pick up with Shaka Khan, Angelique Kidjo, and Gladys Knight. 3 very iconic women and iconic voices. Let's move on now to Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, 100 Real-Life Tales of Black Woman Power. Tonight, we start out with Barbara Hillary, nurse and adventurer. She's born right here in the United States of America, June 12, 1931, and her transition was November 23rd, 2019. Here's the illustration of Barbara Hillary. Barbara was always a curious child. Lucky for her, that curiosity never went away. After 55 years as a full-time nurse and part-time taxi driver, she was ready for a new adventure. She wanted to visit all the places she never had the time or money to see before. Did she start out with a quiet trip to a sunny beach? Not Barbara. She booked herself a trip to Canada in the middle of winter. There, she photographed humongous polar bears and learned how to dog sled across frozen fields. Loving the snowy landscape, she decided to become the first black woman to reach the North Pole. To prepare, Barbara collected fleece clothes, took lots of vitamins, ran miles on the treadmill, and pumped iron at the gym. She took skiing lessons and raised money for supplies. Then she hired guides to help her across the ever shifting ice floes. Barbara took 2 bumpy helicopter rides to get close to the North Pole. The gear she carried was heavy, and the journey was longer and colder than any she'd made before. And because of a cancer surgery she'd had a few years before, her lungs weren't the best. But she didn't let that stop her. 75-year-old Barbara skied the rest of the way. When she reached the North Pole, she jumped up and down and screamed into the frosty air. She'd made it to the top of the world. And she wasn't done yet. Right before her 80th birthday, Barbara trekked to the South Pole. Her adventurous spirit took her all over the world, and she loved every minute of it. Barbara says, at every phase in your life, look at your options, please. Do not select boring ones. Isn't that some advice? All right. Our next young lady coming out of Florida, and she is still alive, is Bessie Stringfield, motorcyclist. Born February 16. Oh, I'm so sorry. She was born 1911 and she lived until February 16, 1993. So my correction there. She says, I spent most of my life alone looking for family. I found my family in motorcycling. Once upon a time, a young woman named Bessie received the most extraordinary gift, a motorcycle. She was 16 years old. It wasn't very ladylike, according to the big gossips around town. She ignored them and revved her engine with a mighty roar. Exhaust smoke trailed behind her like an old friend. At 19, Bessie was tired of riding around the same old streets. She pulled out a map, closed her eyes, and flipped a penny. Wherever it landed, Bessie went. Her hair spilled out from beneath her helmet, catching the wind and light, as she crisscrossed her way around the country, visiting 48 states total. But the country was still segregated. On the road, Bessie couldn't sleep in motels or eat at any diner she passed. Instead, she relied on the kindness of black families in town she visited or slept on her bike under the stars. She shrugged when people asked her about the dangers of being a black woman on the road. I had my ups and downs, she said. In her lifetime, Bessie owned 27 motorcycles, and each one had a story. With one, she performed a stunt known as the Wall of Death, where she raced around the inside of a giant metal globe, even riding upside down. And she rode more than a few in the Orange Blossom Parade in Miami, Florida, where she lived for many years. Well into her 70s, Bessie rode her blue motorcycle to church. The motorcycle queen of Miami charted her own course. And finally tonight, I believe our last woman for tonight is Beverly Lorraine Green, architect. Beverly was born October 4th, 1915, transitioned August 22nd, 1957, United States of America. Beverly was an only child. She often had to keep herself busy while her father went to work at a law firm and her mother managed the house. Beverly's favorite thing to do was draw. With lines and curves and color, she could make pictures come to life. After high school, she studied architecture, but university life was not easy for Beverly. She stood out in her classes. When she graduated, she was the first black woman at her university to get a degree in architectural engineering. And when she registered as an architect with the state of Illinois in 1942, she became the first licensed black woman architect in the United States. She could now draw and design all the buildings she wanted, or so she thought. Despite all her achievements, Beverly could not find a job in her hometown. No one in Chicago would hire a black female architect. So she packed her bags and moved to New York City. She applied for a job with a company building a housing project. The company did not want black people living in their houses, and Beverly thought they'd never hire a black architect. But she applied for the job anyway. To her surprise, she got the job. Her career had begun. Beverly worked on the designs for an art complex, a university theater, a United Nations headquarters in Paris, and even the funeral home where her memorial service was held. The little girl who loved to draw grew up to design beautiful buildings and break barriers for black women. Beverly Lorraine Green. And make sure I show this one. Bessie Stringfield. Well, that concludes our reading for this evening. I hope that you have enjoyed these women, these icons. And the thing that I get most out of all of these stories that we are reading and learning from is to not let adversity become your identity. I'll say that again. Don't let adversity become your identity. You are so much greater than the things that you have been through. Some of us have been through some very traumatic things. Some of us have been through some very heartbreaking things. Some of us have experienced grief and trauma. But these women are showing you that you don't have to let that be the end of your story. You don't have to let it be the identifiers for your life. So I want to encourage you, as I hope these stories are encouraging you, to go for it, to be the woman that you are called to be, and to not let the things that happen in life stop you from continuing on in your journey of who you're called to be. This has been another episode of Daring Dialogues, and I've been your host tonight, Shantae Charles. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness, so continue to go out and be light. Take care, and God bless.